Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's session, Detect Early, Act Early, Improving Diagnosis of Type 1 Diabetes. Thank you all for joining. I would like to begin by thanking the International Diabetes Federation and the International Society for Pediatric and Adolescent Diabetes for their leadership and collaboration in advancing policy, awareness, and action around early detection and screening. Initiatives like these are essential in driving meaningful change at both clinical and systemic levels. By way of a brief introduction, my name is Álvarez Pagola, and I serve as Impact Coordinator with Inodia, where I work on integrating the perspectives of people living with type 1 diabetes into clinical research and strategic initiatives. I am also head of scientific relations of DDoC, and I'm a proud member of the International Diabetes Federation's Blue Circle Voices. I'm joining today both in my professional capacity and as someone living with type 1 diabetes myself. Today's session focuses on a critically important topic, early detection and timely diagnosis, and the vital role these play in improving both immediate and long-term health outcomes. As we know, type 1 diabetes is often diagnosed only once symptoms become severe, and in many cases when individuals present diabetic ketoacidosis or DKA, which is a life-threatening complication. Earlier identification can significantly reduce emergency diagnosis, hospitalizations, and trauma for families, while also opening the door to monitoring, education, and emerging therapies aimed at delaying disease progression. Screening and early detection programs are also transforming how we understand this health condition, enabling identification of type 1 diabetes in its earliest stages, sometimes years before clinical onset, and thus creates opportunities for prevention, research, and more proactive anticipatory care pathways. Today's discussion will explore how we can strengthen diagnosis pathways, raise awareness of early signs, and build systems that support earlier, safer, and more person-centered diagnosis. We are delighted to bring together leading experts and advocates to share insights, evidence, and practical perspectives on how, together, we can truly detect early and act early. Thank you again for being here, and I look forward to a very engaging discussion. But before we move on, some basic housekeeping rules. First of all, this webinar will be recorded, and as an additional feature, you can activate Zoom generated subtitles by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom window. The recording, slides, and feedbacks questionnaire will be sent to all registrants in a few days, so check your spam folder. Participants who attend at least 80% of the event live will receive an attendance certificate only if they also complete a feedback questionnaire. So be on the lookout and check your spam folder if you have not received them in 5 days. And please use the Q&A question and answer function to pose your questions to speakers and panelists. Now, we are going to hear some words of welcome from the IDF President, Professor Peter Schwarz.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, welcome to today's webinar. I'm Peter Schwarz, I'm President of the International Diabetes Federation, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. We are here to go through the IDF ISPAD Policy Brief on type 1 diabetes screening and early detection, which is being launched today. So congratulations. Type 1 diabetes is a lifelong autoimmune condition that requires continuous insulin therapy. And this defines some of the burden, the specific burden related to the disease. It affects more than 9 million people worldwide, and it has a global impact, and its impact continues to grow. This is a critical issue for the International Diabetes Federation and also the global diabetes community. Delayed diagnosis remains common and can lead to serious and sometimes life-threatening health consequences. Missing diagnosing is even worse. While type 1 diabetes cannot yet be prevented, scientific advances are changing what is possible before symptoms appear. And this is very, very hopeful. We can now identify individuals at risk years before the clinical onset, allowing closer monitoring and earlier, safer diagnosis. At the same time, there are therapies that can delay the onset of type 1 diabetes, offering new hope for prevention-focused approaches. However, access to screening and therapeutic advances remains limited, particularly in low and very low income countries. This is why the International Diabetes Federation, in partnership with ISPAD, is launching this policy brief today. During this webinar, our speakers will present the evidence and approaches to screening and early detection, explain how science can be translated into policy and practice, highlight the importance of multi-sectoral partnership to improve awareness and research in type 1 diabetes. I would like to thank our speakers today for sharing their expertise and thank you all for attending this policy brief. I hope today's discussion will be fruitful and inspiring, and I look forward to future IDF online events where we continue to advance conversations around diabetes. So from my side, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you for your enthusiasm, your passion, your commitment to the life of people living with diabetes, living with type 1 diabetes, and I would like to thank you for your actions.
And now we're also going to hear some welcome words from the ISPAD President, Professor Fergus Cameron.
On behalf of the International Society for Pediatric and Adolescent Diabetes, I would like to welcome you to this co-sponsored event with the International Diabetes Federation. This event is about why the screening and early detection of type 1 diabetes has become an increasingly important area in diabetes care. We no longer think of type 1 diabetes as a condition that starts from the moment of diagnosis in a family doctor's clinic or an accident and emergency department. We now think of type 1 diabetes as beginning with a genetic risk, followed by autoantibody development, increasing dysglycemia, and finally osmotic symptoms and clinical presentation, stages 1 to 3. This redefining of stages in type 1 diabetes is important, as it recognises different windows for detection and intervention. In stage 2 and 3 disease, we are now on the cusp of a new era of immunotherapy in diabetes care. Results from immunotherapy trials are coming thick and fast, which is incredibly exciting. The challenge, though, is deciding who should be screened and how this should be done. Type 1 diabetes is neither a rare disease nor a common disease. Population-based screening will therefore result in testing many to find the few. Risk-based screening, such as first-degree family members, will test fewer but probably miss the many without a family history. Therein lies the tension. Complexity is added in terms of how best to screen. Genetic markers first, immunologic markers second, or vice versa. Which childhood ages provide the greatest access and detection rates? What of the psychological burden that accompanies screening for a disease that still cannot be prevented? What are the secondary benefits, such as prevention of diabetic ketoacidosis? Are these significant or overstated? The purpose of this event is to discuss these issues in light of the increasing evidence base and how they fit into the various consensus statements that are being promulgated by the various diabetes societies. The last 2 decades have arguably been the technology era of diabetes care. The next 2 decades will hopefully be the disease modification era of diabetes care. To modify means we first need to detect. That is the challenge.
Type 1 diabetes is caused by an autoimmune response against insulin-producing cells in the pancreas and therefore requires lifelong insulin therapy at present and exacts a huge human and economic burden globally. Next slide. Importantly, the diagnosis is not always easy. It can occur in very young children from the second half of the first year of life right through into adulthood. And in children in particular, the symptoms can resemble those of common viral illnesses and urinary tract infections, dehydration, and even abdominal emergencies sometimes. So these are some of the common conditions that can be confused as the diagnosis when in fact it is type 1 diabetes. Next slide. An important number of people diagnosed who have adult type 1 diabetes are actually initially misdiagnosed as type 2 diabetes because of its commonness in the adult population. And this delays the start of insulin therapy and therefore increases the risk of complications and ketoacidosis. Next slide, please. The risk of type 1 diabetes is about 50% genetic and about 50% from environmental exposures. And while there's been a lot of research in cohorts followed from early life as to what those key exposures might be that push a child into developing the first stages of type 1 diabetes, such as viral infections, early life weight, growth and nutrition, gut health, and even in some cases psychological stress, importantly, we still don't have any actionable approaches to these exposures to prevent or reduce the number of cases of type 1 diabetes. Next slide. Screening for islet autoantibodies that we've heard mentioning tonight, which are the autoantibodies which attack the insulin-producing cells, allows the early identification of type 1 diabetes, often years before symptoms appear, and therefore years before the person needs insulin. And that allows for close monitoring, and cohorts which have monitored children at risk with these antibodies have largely prevented ketoacidosis at diagnosis. Next slide. The global impact of type 1 diabetes continues to increase, with more than 9 million people estimated to have the condition in 2024. And importantly, this is not just a childhood diagnosis. Over half of new diagnoses occur in adults aged 20 years or older. And also very sobering and concerning is it's estimated that about a fifth of the deaths attributable to type 1 diabetes globally are in people who are not diagnosed with type 1 diabetes under 25 years of age or diagnosed very late. Next slide. Our community-based screening and awareness programs can support the detection of type 1 diabetes. We're talking here about education to pick up the early symptoms and make the diagnosis early before the person is very unwell. But large-scale universal screening, be it in this nature or be it talking about picking up the earlier signs before there are symptoms in the early stages of type 1 diabetes, remain very costly and essentially unfeasible at the present time to implement in low and middle income countries. Global awareness programs currently have some targets for 2030, just to put things in perspective, for 80% of the diagnoses of type 1 diabetes to be achieved and for 100% access to insulin. And these are really our priorities in this situation. Next slide. But the recent advances, such as the medication teplizumab, which is a monoclonal antibody against CD3 on the T cells, and which was recently approved by the European Commission for stage 2 type 1 diabetes and previously by the Federal Drug Authority in the USA and by some other countries, have demonstrated the potential to delay the onset type 1 diabetes by around 2 to 2.5 years if you can detect people at an early stage of type 1 diabetes before they actually need insulin. And this is a major kind of paradigm shift and breakthrough, showing that we could delay and potentially in the future prevent type 1 diabetes. There are other trials and progress and other very promising agents, what we call disease-modifying therapy. And this area is really evolving quite quickly, as Fergus Cameron mentioned. But to detect people who are going to benefit from these immune modulating agents, you have to have screening programs to pick up the autoantibodies before the person has any symptoms. And these screening programs are currently being investigated in some countries for their feasibility and cost effectiveness. And there are three big goals we've already talked about, really. But first, to prevent ketoacidosis by monitoring the person at risk of type 1 diabetes and preventing them from getting ill by beginning insulin before they have ketoacidosis, by providing support and education for that family and individual so they have a kind of softer journey towards type 1 diabetes, and by access to these increasing number of trials and hopefully in the future therapies for people at risk of type 1 diabetes. Next slide. But again, just to put things in perspective globally, improving access to insulin for everyone who needs it, glucose monitoring technologies for everyone, and importantly, mental health support remains a global priority, particularly in those regions where essential medications and technologies are unaffordable or unavailable. And so the big barriers are cost and the messages provided by public health authorities. Next slide. So the final key takeaway is the push for the stronger health policies and partnerships are essential to allow these advances to actually help as many people as possible. We must integrate, or governments must integrate, type 1 diabetes diagnosis and care into universal health coverage frameworks, expand public awareness initiatives, and invest in research and innovation. Some key interventions for low-income countries are community health training about the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes and the fact that it can be in all age groups, from babies through to older adults. For subsidised bulk pricing for insulin, portable diagnostic tools so the diagnosis can be made easily with a finger prick to test the glucose level and the ketones, education and public awareness of type 1 diabetes and the importance to make the diagnosis as early as possible, and partnerships with non-government organisations to expand the reach of these programs. Next slide. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your enthusiasm about this policy brief. Please download it by the QR code. The recommendations are on page 22 in the summary. And again, thank you for this opportunity to be part of this great initiative.
Thank you, Professor Couper, for that very interesting presentation. And please, everybody, remember to scan the QR code, download the policy brief, and learn more about this very, very important initiative. The earlier we detect, the earlier we act, the better the outcome. The outcomes, sorry about that. And now let's go to Lucia Feito Allonca from Spain and Nkiruka Okoro from UK, by way of other places sometimes, on the policy recommendations from this IDF ISPAD Policy Brief.
So thank you so much, Mrs. Moderator. As part of this policy brief, we have also contributed with stories, with our views and perspectives of people who live with the disease, with diabetes. So we have integrated not just the knowledge about screening, not just the prevention, but also the voices, the experiences of those of us who were diagnosed and how we are living and interpreting all this new screening reality, which is new for many of us. In my case, I first learned about screening when I was at the Diabetes Center in Rotterdam during the ISPAD conference. I didn't know that type 1 diabetes was a disease that was happening at stages. So I learned then everything about it. Then I got tested for autoantibodies. And then I got to learn much more within Nodia, that is doing research, clinical trials all across Europe, and working on prevention and detection. That is, everything is so connected. All these new realities also engage with the psychosocial aspects of screening, because when a person gets screened, they got an important emotional workload. Maybe will I have autoantibodies? Maybe not. There's a new reality that has to be addressed, not just in the clinical aspect, but also in the peer support aspect, in the psychosocial aspect, in the peer community, because we can provide so much to our peers living with diabetes. So these experiences, and we have so many during the policy brief. You have mine, Nkiruka's, Ricardo, Anna's, Anita, Sabidi. All of them are here today. And I will start first by introducing this piece. This was my part. This was my story. And I finished my comment recommending all policymakers, making the recommendation that screening should be integrated into universal health coverage system. Well, how can we do that? Just by raising awareness. That is the most important thing at the moment, because without awareness, we don't know what type 1 diabetes is. We're still struggling differentiating type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So first we have to identify what type 1 diabetes is, and then we have to know that there is a way to detect it early and to do something about it, because there are drugs that we can use nowadays. So this is important because this information was not out there. So let's integrate this and let's start raising awareness. And now I pass it on to Nkiruka so that she can introduce herself and her story.
Good afternoon from the UK. It's quite cold here today. So it's a great honor to be a part of this webinar. And today, Lucia and I will be talking about the policy recommendations from IDF and ISPAD. And from my perspective, I am a person living with type 1 diabetes. It's going to be 38 years this month on the 22nd. And I have lived with this disease from age 7. And I was the first from my family that was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. It was, I was the 5th generation from my mother's side of the family. And it was really devastating for us because we didn't know it was type 1 diabetes at first. I was misdiagnosed and only diagnosed properly after I went into a coma. So having this policy recommendation now is so interesting, and it has opened a wider perspective for myself because I've got 2 children now, and I had to get them tested for the autoantibodies. And it has given me the opportunity to look out for things that were not looked out for me on my own side and when I was diagnosed. So with this now, it's the best thing that has ever happened to any person living with type 1 diabetes as a parent and you have kids. There's a policy now that has been put in place that will make things better. So looking at the second policy recommendation, strengthening public and professional awareness. This is very, very important because the more we talk about this, the more people are enlightened about what they can do and how they can prevent unwanted and sudden death from people who are not aware that they might have this genetic predisposition of the autoantibody that could result in type 1 diabetes. So launching a mass media campaign is something that is a must do. And we need to partner with schools, workplaces, communities. Let's raise more awareness and let's reduce stigma because there's so much stigma attached to type 1 diabetes. And so many people are not willing to go ahead and get themselves tested or get their children tested. So we need more emphasis on continuous education and professional training for our healthcare workers on type 1 diabetes so that they're aware of new and upcoming therapies that can actually halt or prevent people developing DKA earlier than they should. So I'll hand over back to Lucia to take the next slide.
Thank you, Nkiruka. And it's really true what you mentioned that some people might be reluctant to screen their children because of this stigma that you were mentioning. And it's so harmful because fear is preventing families from getting the education, the tools that they need to face this stage 3 of type 1 diabetes that is going to come anyway, but it can be delayed and it can be contained. And we have the tools to do that at the moment, so it's really essential. It's also equally important to reinforce global collaboration and policy integration, integrating type 1 diabetes care into the schemes of universal health coverage and primary care policies, and strengthening as well global partnerships with, for example, IDF, ISPAD, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and so on, to share knowledge, resources, and best practices, because we know, and we know this in the diabetes space, in the NCD space, that when we work together, we are stronger. It happens every single time. So this is not an exception, and we have to enact policies to guarantee access to essential diagnosis for type 1 diabetes, medicines, and technologies. Next slide, please. Nkiruka.
Okay, so moving on from where Lucia has spoken excellently well, honestly, we need to focus so much on long-term studies to help us make this available to every single person, irrespective of where you live, where you come from, with funded research studies that are easily affordable. This will offer so many people the opportunity to get tested and to prevent the deadly DKA from happening. So it's really, really important that we get this long-term We don't want it to like stay locked away in academic spaces. We want it working like today, not tomorrow, and it should be ongoing. And we also need to support clinical trials and immune therapy stem cell approaches on beta cell preservation. This is also a research area that is very interesting, and I'm looking forward to more work being done in this regard. It will really, really give us persons living with type 1 diabetes and children who are at risk of developing type 1 diabetes through the antibody testing. It's very, very important, honestly. We need to focus and invest a lot on research and innovation. This is one area that we need more money put into. So it's very, very important. Next slide, please. Lucia, over to you.
Yes, funding is essential, and we should not forget that everything requires funding. We're also going through a very sensitive moment when it comes to funding and health. So it's essential to find resources to expand early detection and screening. How? Well, this is the last recommendation of the policy brief, and it establishes to establish national and regional early T1D screening programs for high-risk groups. And who do we consider high-risk groups? Family members of people living with type 1 diabetes. But beyond these people who are at risk because for example, their father has type 1 diabetes or their mother does, beyond that, we should not forget that 90% of people diagnosed with type 1 diabetes have no known family member. So the importance of screening is truly global, complete, and beyond being initially at risk or not. Then other parameters will follow. For example, having one autoantibody, having two autoantibodies. Well, strengthen digital health systems to track and follow early stage T1 diabetes. It's important, and this connects with national and regional programs, because if we cooperate cross borders in different countries, for example, in the European region, across the many countries that the European region has, well, we can share expertise, we can share methodologies, we can see what the best practices are, and we can do something, really create a common framework that benefits the cause of screening for everybody, and then expand community-based screening to reach urban and rural populations, so it spreads as much as possible. That's the goal.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you, Nkiruka, for this amazing presentation and listing of things to do and how to. I just add, find out what's going on locally, what early stage T1D detection programs are there around, and also early detection initiatives, because sometimes we just cannot predict what's going to happen. We cannot do the early stage detection, but we can prevent complications when stage 3 is actually there. So thank you so much. Now we're going to see a short video of John telling his story, He's the founder and campaign lead of Lyla's law campaign, and he's pushing for legislation in this regard.
Hello everyone. I address you all today with a story that no parent should ever have to tell. It is the story of Lyla, our little girl, whose life was cut short in May last year because the warning signs of type 1 diabetes were missed. Lyla was 2 years old, bright, fit as a fiddle, full of life, and had her whole future ahead of her. But in a matter of days, everything changed. She became unwell, and like so many parents, we trusted the system to protect her. That trust was misplaced. By the time her condition was recognised, it was too late. Lyla's tragedy is not an isolated case. It is a symptom of a system that is failing our children, and today I am asking you all to see if you can help change that. NHS England tells us that type 1 diabetes is uncommon in young children, but let me share the reality. Most diagnoses in the UK occur between 6 months and 5 years old, and here is the most chilling statistic. 26% of all diagnoses happen when the child is already in diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA, a life-threatening state. For children under 5, that figure rises between 38% and 45%. That means that almost half of our young children in the UK have been diagnosed when they are critically ill, strapped to tables, fighting for their lives. We are told that 1 in 500 children in the UK develop type 1 diabetes. That is not rare when it's a chronic condition that will never go away. Today, roughly 35,000 children and young people under 19 with diabetes live with diabetes in the UK, and over 90% of them have type 1. The UK has the 5th highest rate of childhood type 1 diabetes in the world, so I ask you all, why are GPs not taking this seriously enough? Since the COVID-19 pandemic, diagnoses have risen sharply, exceeding pre-pandemic levels. Vigilance is not optional, it is essential. Yet GPs in the UK on average receive 15 minutes of training on type 1 diabetes during medical school. 15 minutes. And most have little to no training in paediatric care. The average GP will diagnose one person with type 1 diabetes in their entire career. That is not rare, that is failure. Because too many children have been diagnosed in DKA, in hospital, when it's almost too late. All of these issues must be resolved. I have personally received nearly 400 emails from parents of children who were diagnosed in critical care after collapsing in DKA. And these emails are just a drop in the ocean compared to the tens of thousands of messages that I've received online. Every individual story is of a person, a beautiful person, not a number or statistic. I have had parents writing to me saying, "Thank you for saving my child's life." But I remind them, it was Lyla who saved them. It's Lyla's story that was the straw that broke the camel's back and sparked this national movement that is reaching people worldwide. Her story made them and GPs act quicker when their child showed symptoms. But let me be clear, no parent should have to rely on a social media post to save their child's life. No parent should have to learn about type 1 diabetes from a tragedy. That is why we're here today. Lyla's law is simple. It aims to make UK clinical guidelines enshrine in law, not just a page that we can click through and dismiss. It also calls for mandatory information in the Red Book for health visitors to every newborn baby. Better public awareness campaigns so that parents know the signs, and proper education for GPs and frontline healthcare professionals. Because right now, the system is leaving families to chance, and that chance is killing children. This is not about politics, it's about saving lives. This is about ensuring that no child dies because a GP didn't know the symptoms. This is about making sure that every parent, every health visitor, every doctor understands that excess thirst, frequent urination, unexplained weight loss, and fatigue are not just a bug or a virus. They could be type 1 diabetes. Think diabetes. As I said previously, the UK has the 5th highest rate of childhood type 1 diabetes in the world. That should shame us into action. We cannot allow ignorance to continue costing lives. So today I'm asking you, every one of you, to stand with us, to stand with Lyla, and the many that die preventable deaths. To make Lyla's law a reality, not just for the UK, but for the world. Because every day we delay, more children end up in intensive care, and some will not come home. Let Lyla's legacy be one of change, of hope, and of life. Let us ensure that no parent ever has to talk about their loved ones in the past tense ever again. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, John. Beautiful Lyla, with about 650 attendees here. We do hope that Lyla's story is repeated, is shared, and that no more children have to die in DKA because the system failed her, failed them, failed us sometimes. So spread the word. Get early T1D detection going. Help and participate. Now, let's move on to the question and answers and the discussion panel section. Here, Anita Sabidi is joining us. And Anita, can you please introduce yourself briefly so that everybody knows who you are?
Sure, Anna, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Anita Sabidi. I'm an IDF voice from Indonesia. I also work with type 1 diabetes. I also do the voices. I also a nation coordinator for A40. A lot of things. Especially, I'm also a vice chairman for ISPAD, is the Children's Diabetes Association in Indonesia.
Thank you. Let's start with a very global thing. Nkiruka, Lucia, Anita, you three live with type 1 diabetes. So in connection with the webinar, it would be interesting to know what age you were diagnosed at and whether it was a straightforward diagnosis, if the doctors actually realized it was T1D and your symptoms were identified quickly.
Okay.
Anita? Oh, Nkiruka, will you?
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna. You know, when I listened to John's story about Lyla, it just resonated something within me because my situation was similar to Lyla's. And it's so heartbreaking that she lost her life to misdiagnosis. I was diagnosed at age 7, and I had all the classical symptoms of type 1 diabetes. But everyone just thought, oh, she's got malaria or she's got typhoid. Until one very night when my mom woke up because she noticed I was going to the bathroom like more often than the other previous nights. And she was even angry because she said I was making too much noise. She said, why are you making so much noise? You're in and out, in and out, in and out of the bathroom. I was like, Mom, I actually peed on myself. And she raised her voice and she was like, how can you pee on yourself? You're 7 years old, blah, 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 blah. So my dad said, don't you think it's unusual for her? She's never done this before. It's unusual for her. So he said, no school for you when it's time for school, because it was about 3 a.m. in the morning. He says, I'm taking you to the hospital. This is unlike you, and I'm sure something is going on. So at 8 o'clock, we were at the hospital, my dad and I, and the doctors, the first thing they said, oh, she's got malaria, because I started having a temperature and I was throwing up. And those are classical signs of DKA. I had a very, very bad upset stomach. I just couldn't, I was feeling sick. And they just said, oh, we need to admit her immediately. She has malaria. She's got typhoid. No test was carried out, nothing. This was back home in Nigeria. So they put the first vial of dextrose. I was fine, but my dad said, there's something wrong with you. You're not getting any better. You seem to have gotten thinner and more thirsty. And the doctor says, oh, she needs more. I ended up having 6 vials of dextrose. And that was when I went into a coma. And the doctor was like, oh, we don't know what's wrong with her. You need to take her to the teaching hospital, because we went to a private hospital. And that was how I ended up at the teaching hospital. But by the time we got there, my red blood cells have already been covered with glucose. I didn't have any oxygen, and they pronounced me dead on arrival. And that was how they took me into the morgue and were telling my parents, oh, sorry, we've lost your daughter. We couldn't resuscitate her. She was already dead on arrival. And when that happened, I think my dad got his driver to bring my siblings to the hospital when all this was going on. My twin sister, God love her so much, as in she saved my life. She kept telling my dad's friend, who was the doctor that pronounced me dead, and said, God says she's not dead. And she kept hitting on him and saying, bring her out of there. She's not meant to be there. And that was how the doctor went in and noticed that my chest went up and down. He felt my pulse. It was very faint. And he says, oh, she's not dead. Get her out of there. And when John spoke about Lyla, everything came rushing back, because I couldn't have been here today if not for my sister. So cutting the long story short, I was transferred to my mom's gynecologist, who is an American. And just as soon as he smelt my breath, he told my parents, I know what's wrong with your daughter. And that was how I was diagnosed. And this is me now, 38 years down the line. And I have 2 children now. And because of all this carry on and having family history of diabetes from both sides of my family, I got my kids genetically tested for the autoantibodies. And now we have to keeping an eye on them. They're not symptomatic in any way, in as much as they've got the two antibodies present. So that's me keeping an eye. And when I saw this policy recommendation by IDF and ISPAD, that was the best thing. I said, now we don't need to lose any more lives again. Now we can save more lives. So that's my short story. And I'm glad that I'm here to speak about it.
We're all glad you're here, Nkiruka, and I'm glad you could test your kids and you know what's coming and how to prepare. Anita, is your story kind of like that too? Very dramatic story?
Yeah, but we have to know that I'm coming from Indonesia, LMICs, and I was diagnosed back in 1997. I was 13 years old. I developed the symptoms. I went to the toilet a lot. I even got bullied at school because I went to the toilet so often. They called me broken water tap because I went to the toilet so much. But it doesn't ring a bell. And I'm really skinny. And I don't know, probably back in Asia, I mean, girls skinny, they look good. So it doesn't ring a bell at all. But when I got weaker, that's when I went to the hospital and got diagnosed with diabetes, not type 1. I only know that I have diabetes, and the doctor wanted me to use insulin. That's where that's when I realized there's a awareness gap. My my parents decided not to use insulin, so they took me home without insulin. And they tried me traditional approach instead of medical ones, which is it's putting me really in a very critical condition. That's when my father realized that it's not working, so he put me back to the hospital. And in the hospital, since no one understands about diabetes happen to children, my dad told me that Anita, you have to manage diabetes by yourself because no one understands about it. And I was 13 at that time, and it's really difficult for me as a teenager diagnosed with diabetes. And I later find out about type 1. It's like when I was in college. That's when I asked my endo, I want to check my C-peptide. And then I had my C-peptide check, and it was 0.0032. And then that's where my endo explained about type 1 diabetes. So it's a quite gap of years when I realized that I have type 1 diabetes, because I have no idea at all. I just know that I have diabetes since I was a teen. The awareness, the challenges, but it's also maybe personally driven. Why? Because as I'm a mother of 2 boys, and my other son, he was a pre-diabetic since he was 5 years old. That's why I'm really passionate about type 1 screening. And so we don't have antibody checking in Indonesia right now, but we did an evaluation test. We sent 40 samples for type 1 screening, antibody, and I included my son. And it turned out he's negative, but he's still pre-diabetic, so he was closely monitored by ped endo right now. So yes, sorry for me.
Quite a story too. Thank you, Anita. So there's still, the journey still has a long way to go.
Yes.
And your stories come from 2 very different parts of the world. And Lucia is another different part of the world also. So Lucia, you were diagnosed as a child too, right?
Yes, I was diagnosed in Spain when I was 10 years old. I started drinking a lot and going to the bathroom all the time. So my grandmother identified that could be diabetes right away. So she rushed me to the hospital, and then my blood glucose levels were 200. So the diagnosis was confirmed immediately. But how did my granny know? How did she know that? Well, because she lost a son, my uncle, to an undiagnosed diabetes, because my uncle died when he was over 20 years old, so super young, a boy. And the reason for his death was kidney failure. But it was not kidney failure, it was an undiagnosed diabetes. So my grandmother learned to identify these symptoms when it was sadly too late. But luckily for me, it was early and it could be identified. So that's the reason why screening and early detection resonates with me that much, because it's what we have been repeating all the time. It can save lives. And nowadays we are used to living with diabetes and thriving with diabetes. We have very good quality of life. We can't complain, but it was not always like that. And we have gone a long road. There's so much to do still, but we have to completely avoid everything that's preventable and start raising awareness on this essential, very important topic.
Essential and very important. Those are 2 words, 3 words actually, that really resonate with everybody, I think. Thank you for sharing your very personal stories. And I would like to go to Jennifer with very specific questions, because you mentioned that type 1 diabetes can be sometimes misdiagnosed and confused with other health conditions and other types of diabetes too. Can you please elaborate a little bit on this?
Yes, I think it's, I think the important thing, and I think this is still a problem for primary care and even in countries with good resources like Australia, where I live, we still have, a third to almost 40% of children present with DKA. So, even when there's resources, it's relatively late. When they get to the hospital, usually they're okay from then, but still, worldwide, this is a problem, not just in places where the resources are low. But in terms of the misdiagnosis, I think that one of the problems is for a general practitioner, a child with urinary symptoms is much more likely to be urinary tract infection, or a child with, who seems unwell, especially a young child. And we would say, a sick young child, just have diabetes on your list, because most people, they don't have to be able to diagnose something perfectly. They just have it as an option. It's unlikely for it to be completely missed. Does that make sense? So knowing everything about it or knowing all the details of how it might present isn't really necessary. If you just have it as an option on that list. So we always say to medical students, if you have a sick young baby, that it can still be diabetes, because it's not always obvious, the symptoms in a very young child, because a child, is wearing nappies or just seems sick. And sometimes it's not until they're breathing differently because of the coma coming on and they come in like a respiratory case. And so there's still late diagnoses, but it's just what worries me most is not having type 1 diabetes on your list, because these stories you tell, which are horrible stories of the way you had to start diabetes. You just sort of feel if that had been higher up on the list, it wouldn't have got quite that far. And so I think the idea that also 50% or so of diabetes is diagnosed over 20 years of age. So it's both a condition of very little children from about 6 months onwards right through. It can be as late as 50, 60 years of age. And the interesting thing about picking up early stage type 1 diabetes, so picking it up before the symptoms we've been talking about, and with that opportunity to potentially intervene and certainly monitor the person, is that those autoantibodies, they come on very early in life. They come on from the end of the first year of life and they peak around the second or third year. So all these things are happening really early. So that's, in a way, was a surprise when that was first discovered some 30 years ago. But it is all happening very early. So the time the person presents, it's really the sort of end of a long period of destruction of the insulin-producing cells.
So it would be really relevant, really important to try to get as much early stage T1D detection and to prevent and to avoid stage 3.
Yes, right. I mean, certainly, I think we've got to, and this is what's good about the policy brief, I think, we've got to think of there's a tension between talking about screening for early type 1 diabetes and realizing there's still a significant number of people who don't have access to insulin. So I guess, first things first, we want, like those 203 goals, everybody to have access to insulin and almost everybody with type 1 diabetes to get that correct diagnosis. That's first things first. But once we're achieving that in that region, then we can start thinking about how can we pick up the diagnosis earlier. Because even we talk about teplizumab and at that stage, but even you can get in even a little bit later, you could always also still preserve insulin production. Maybe not completely prevent insulin, but keep it simpler. So there are many sort of levels to all this, I think. But I mean, first things first, then after that, it is very exciting that increasingly we can look as though we can at least delay, if not prevent, type 1 diabetes. And I think we realize now that the prevention of type 1 diabetes now is not some unattainable goal. I think we realize now it's going to be obtainable.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So we should kind of stage our interventions depending on what is available locally, right? Prevent life-saving first, and then move on to prevention and early. And the earlier we go, get the better, right? Great. Now, in low-income countries with limited health budgets, what would be the ideal? way of diagnosis of
Yeah.
T1
That's a really,
type.
really relevant, important question, because you just picking up diabetes before symptoms requires relatively expensive tests, and indeed, very few countries have screening for that. That's going to impact many numbers because it's usually just in high risk groups or in some sort of research study. So I think it's a really important question. And I think what I see the best way is a public awareness of those symptoms. And it has to be I think everyone has to be aware of that. It can't just be the practitioners and the health providers, but just that public awareness that if your child starts being thirsty and going to the toilet a lot, it may well be something like something different, or just that they're unwell for some of the reasons. But just that idea, there's a condition called diabetes that can come on quite fast and make children thirsty and lose weight and feel tired and go to the toilet a lot and wet their bed at night. Just that simple advice about the symptoms. I think that's the way. I mean, it's just how best you roll out that type of campaign with the most effect. And I've had no experience in this, so I, express there'll be people, I'm sure, online who are more skilled at knowing how best to do this for public health campaigns. But I think, we're talking really about early detection of those early symptoms.
And perhaps it's not just public awareness, but training GPs and general practitioners and first contact. Sometimes they dismiss certain symptoms without actually realizing. So maybe it's a combined thing. My opinion. That's my personal, and I shouldn't be doing
that. And it happens in all countries. And
in all countries, definitely.
And as someone said, the average, I think it was Lyla's dad, that the average GP will make the diagnosis once.
Exactly.
That's not so often, right? I mean, and so we would say to GP, sick child, think of diabetes and just get them to hospital.
Exactly.
So sick child, get them to hospital. But remember that urinary symptoms could be diabetes, just as long as you just have that in your list somewhere.
It should be in your list.
Somewhere.
Going back to the early detection topic is we can say it's only meaningful if it leads to action. And this is a question for everybody. Once a person is screened and identified as at risk with 1 or 2 autoantibodies, what is next? Because many health systems have no capacity to do the follow-up and take specific actions. So what can be done? Just anybody? Anita? Okay, Anita. Okay, yeah. From the lived experience.
I completely agree with this Prof Jennifer, because when my son had a high fever and I took him to the hospital, I casually checked his blood sugar and apparently it's above 200. And then the follow-up is he's having his A1C check and it's a pre-diabetic. And since we don't have antibody checking yet, so what we did in our healthcare system is that we did a periodically A1C checking and his target is to be below pre-diabetic. So what we're being very cautious on is when he's on his puberty, because there's a hormonal changes and we fear that it might trigger his type 1. So that's why he had his periodic A1C checking and 3 months consultation with his ped endo as a follow-up.
Okay, so it was just follow-up. Great.
Yeah.
Any other ideas for what kind of action can be taken?
Perhaps go for it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Nkiruka?
so Anita has talked about the clinical side of things, which is excellent. And for me, I also think, in addition to what Anita has said and Jennifer, we also need to look into psychological support, so early counseling, mental health check-ins, and a support process to help with anxiety, uncertainty, and the anticipatory stress. So it's very important. And education, we need to try and get age-appropriate, culturally sensitive education on what at risk really means and what to expect and how to recognize all these early symptoms is very important without sending fear-based messaging. It's very, very important. And community support, like all of us here with lived experience, people listening to what we have to say, our voices matter a lot, and the advocacy so that we can reduce and normalize, reduce the isolation associated with diabetes and normalize the experience. Because when you tell people how well you live with the disease, their minds are actually more at rest and they don't feel anxious or have a lot of fear about it. That's why I always tell people, I don't look at diabetes as an enemy. Even my kids, they know it. I love everything about diabetes. So many people might not agree with me, but I've made diabetes my pal. And in turn, diabetes has made me its pal. So I would label diabetes a he or a she. I'll just label it an it. So understanding diabetes will make diabetes understand you. So when people who are at risk see us with lived experience, they will feel more at ease. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now, we do have gaps, regional gaps in access to screening. So some areas are better equipped, others are not. Is there a possibility, or what can cross-border collaboration do to bridge these gaps in access to type 1D, T1D screening? And anybody who wants to answer, to propose an idea? Okay, Anita, there you are. Yes.
Yes, yeah, especially on the antibody screening, because I'm really excited towards this policy brief. Why? Because through this policy brief, we can advocate to government to encourage or to endorse our partnership with our local union on developing type 1 screening antibodies. We did try to make one, but it's costly. It's still costly. So that's why I'm feeling very hopeful towards this policy brief, and hopefully we know that some of our neighboring countries also have the type 1 screening. So we can have these collaborations all together to have type 1 screening more accessible in our region as well.
That would be great. Now I have a bit of a more technical question for Jennifer, which is, why does type 1 diabetes progress at such different rates? Why is it that people who test positive for islet autoantibodies, for example, could be diagnosed at very different moments down the line?
The short answer is we don't quite know, but I think it's important to stress that it's very different if you're a young child. If you're picked up, under 4 and you have multiple antibodies by that age, you're going to progress more quickly than if you're picked up at an older age. So we have to see a younger child at a more immediate risk. And I think the other important point is just one antibody on its own. Most likely, if that just stays that way, most likely you won't develop type 1 diabetes in your lifetime. The vast majority of people, so we've got to be very careful we don't overreact to those people, cause unnecessary anxiety. So they do need correct advice about risk, because that risk uncertainty, which you mentioned, is very, very real. We don't want to do harm rather than good. So it's very much the age and how many antibodies you have that can start telling us how quickly you're progressing. And then you can also look at a time. So the stages of type 1 diabetes are, first of all, you have these one or two or more antibodies. Then you start getting a little bit of up and down in your blood glucose levels, but you have no symptoms and you're perfectly well. And then you start the symptoms. So we don't know exactly why there are these different rates of progression, but we know that certainly age is a very strong risk factor here, and also some genetic effect too on how rapidly you progress to clinical type 1 diabetes.
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule here, right? So we have to monitor what's going on. Okay, now, thank you so much. In general, because we watched John Story's video and the sad story of Lyla dying because she was not diagnosed in time and went into DKA, and that's a story we don't want to hear ever again. And John is currently asking for legislation to make it mandatory to run the routine tests, type 1 diabetes detection tests on children with the symptoms. Do you all agree that this should be mandatory, in addition to just being aware of the fact that this could be a possibility, as you mentioned earlier, Jennifer? And
it's always hard to, I think, when someone's had such a devastating experience as that, in a sense, they have an expertise around that experience that the rest of us, well, certainly I just can't share. I have a relative with type 1 diabetes who was diagnosed relatively late, but, nothing of that sort of tragedy. But I think the problem about saying, the symptoms, so your symptoms can be a child's lost weight and is tired, and you just can't really say that you would necessarily need to do a glucose in every child who's tired, for instance. But there are, when you're getting a cluster of symptoms, and I think a lot of the education programs rightly just show the cluster of symptoms, and it's that cluster which then should lead to the testing. We don't have other conditions that I'm aware of where we have a law that says, when you have bruising, you must test your platelets. Do you know what I mean? It's always difficult. I mean, but I think it's just that cluster of symptoms which needs to cause the alarm to test, not just an individual symptom. Children can be more thirsty for other reasons as well.
Yeah, the famous 4, right? That will. I don't know. What do you think, Lucy, or Nkiruka, or Anita? What's your position on that?
I think in my case that first of all, we have to start raising awareness of what type of diabetes is in the first place. Why? Because at this point, even healthcare professionals sometimes struggle to differentiate that there are 2 types of diabetes, and as type 2 diabetes accounts for the great majority of the diabetes cases, it is seen as the only diabetes, and it's something that's misinformation. So we cannot do anything until we educate our own healthcare professionals in diabetes. It's so basic, but it's still missing, I think, in every country around the world. And beyond that, once that you know what type 1 diabetes is, then you can help manage diabetic ketoacidosis better. You can prevent deaths But first, you must be aware of the condition. And that's the point that we have to tackle in the beginning. Then we can create laws. But without awareness.
So would you say that creating awareness is one of the big challenges we face in preventing late diagnosis? Are there any challenges that you, as our panelists here, anybody can add? Any other challenges faced by trying to have this routine?
Yeah, and probably also to have blood sugar checking in emergency situation by not. So I know because I still remember that when I took my son to the hospital when he had a high fever, he got really weak, short of breathness, but no one checked his blood sugar. Since I have type 1, I just being very aware of this strange symptom. So that's why I checked my son, and apparently he had a high blood sugar. So awareness, and also how to make blood sugar checking part of the checklist in the emergency situation for kids.
Thank you. Okay. Let me see if there's any other questions that can be addressed quickly. We just have a few minutes left. I think that one final question before we finish. There's amazing discussion. Thank you very much, the panel. I know you all, so I'm enjoying our time here. So very briefly, can you explain or let us know what would be your main ask to governments when it comes to T1D screening and early detection? You just one ask, one thing you would want there from the government, from the local administration. One ask. Can you all four say something? Yes, Anita.
Well, so okay, go ahead, Anita.
Okay,
go ahead.
Okay, so currently we have a free medical checkup in all elementary school, but you cannot implement that if not being supported by the education awareness, even in our HEPs. So that's why education will be the key along with the screening itself.
So that's all from me. Education. And Nkiruka?
Okay, so just adding on to what Jennifer said, we can leverage on like existing programs like the T1D risk awareness. So for mothers who live with type 1 diabetes and have children, it should be part of routine ongoing checks. And when you go for your immunization visits, let it also be part of it so that we keep an eye on things and halt things or decrease its progression. So that's one thing I want the government to implement in our universal healthcare systems.
Okay. Lucia?
Yes, I would say that raise awareness by increasing the health literacy of the general population and also of healthcare professionals so that screening routines can be integrated into the universal health coverage package.
Great. Thank you. Jennifer, are you going to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think, gosh, it's hard one thing, but I guess the thing that is really tragic if someone gets the wrong diagnosis. So whatever it takes, and it's just so hard to know because education programs in a way have been slightly disappointing in some areas. But I think, if we could just eliminate that misdiagnosis, and I don't think we have the solution for how you is it just a case of increasing awareness both in the community, in primary care, and is it just a build up of awareness that comes right? I mean, I don't know, but that to me is, we've got to get that right. Yeah.
I personally agree that awareness in the general population is very important, but I also think that the healthcare system as a whole, all the professionals should be better informed of the possibility, and this should, not always does, reduce misdiagnosis. I was misdiagnosed myself because I was the wrong age to have type 1, so I was diagnosed as type 2. And it took a long time and heartbreak, and it wasn't easy to find out I actually had type 1 diabetes, and I was going down a very bad road. So yes, I think, and it was my clinician's mistake, let's say. Mistake might be a bit too strong, but I was misdiagnosed. Tests were not run. So I think we are out of time. Yes, and I'm sorry we are out of time. And as we come to a close of today's session, a great session, I would like to thank all the speakers in person and those who attended virtually through their recordings. I would like to thank the International Diabetes Federation and the International Society for Pediatric and Adolescent Diabetes for their leadership and collaboration in driving this important agenda. And to everyone involved, please, behind the scenes to make today's sessions possible. And thank you all for coming. It's been over 600 attendees today, and we're very thankful. Spread the word, download the document, read it through, share, and have an impact in your local communities. We don't have to change the life of hundreds. If we can touch the life of just one other person, we're doing our job right. And the recording, I'm going to go through this. The recording, slides, and feedback questionnaire will be sent to all registrants in a few days. Please check your spam folder and respond to the feedback questionnaire to help us improve future online events. And if you have any questions, please send them to advocacy@idf.org. And please download the document. So thank you all very much for being here today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.